Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So the end of the year is upon us and I can't believe it because 2021 literally just flew by, like it was crazy. But yeah, it's officially done. You know, next week we are going to be in 2022, which means a whole new slate, a whole new lineup of movies and TV shows to explore and to get excited about. But before we dive into all of that good stuff for 2022, I wanted to go ahead and, wrap some things up, tie up some loose ends for 2021, because there have been so many TV shows, guys, so many movies coming out left, right and center, especially to make up for the deficit in 2020. So I've had a hard time keeping up, trying to give you guys as many reviews as possible of these movies and TV shows. So today I'm taking the opportunity to try and catch up a little bit before I go ahead and do the annual best of videos. Now, for those of you who don't know, here on my channel, every year we do some best of TV shows and best of movies videos. I have been preparing, and by preparing I mean watching a bunch of stuff. I've been preparing for those videos these past couple of days, and not everything is going to be making the cut. So instead of just throwing all of that away, I thought it'd be fun to go through my thoughts and give you guys some mini reviews of some of the stuff that I have seen from 2021 before it's over. Now, this isn't the first what I've been watching video. I have got two previous videos up on my channel if you'd like to check out some more mini reviews of a bunch of stuff that I watched this year. In the previous videos, there was a large focus on TV shows instead of movies, and my channel is called Jean's Movie Chat, so we need to do some movies. We need to get some movies on the board here, and the movies that we're going to be discussing in this video are the ones that, spoiler alert, you're not likely going to be seeing in my best of 2021 video. Before we get into all of that good stuff, as per usual, if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and make sure you turn on your notifications so that you can be told when I upload next. Now, without further ado, let's get into what I've been watching movie edition. So first one up is a movie that I genuinely wish I had the time to review properly, but I ended up catching way later than it was released in cinemas, and because of the hectic release schedule this year, I literally didn't even get a chance to see it in cinemas in the end, and that is Venom, Let There Be Carnage. So this is the sequel to 2018's Venom, which was a surprise hit with Tom Hardy portraying, both Eddie Brock and Venom himself, right? He's doing the voice for Venom. And I think what most fans of that first movie came out thinking was just how great of a pair they are. They are a phenomenal pairing. Venom and Eddie Brock are like the duo. They are the duo in terms of, comic book, movies, series duos. I really enjoy their chemistry. I think they are the shining stars of that entire franchise. Everything else is like, okay. Everything, I could take it or leave it if I'm being honest, because honestly, when it comes to Venom as a franchise, it feels so much like it should have existed in like the late 90s or the early 2000s. It really does feel a bit behind in terms of the comic book movie landscape that we have right now, where things are getting weird and crazy, but the quality of filmmaking has been largely consistent. I just think that Venom is a few steps behind in that regard. But one thing that, like I said, definitely pushes that franchise forward is the relationship between Eddie Brock and Venom, and I think the second film, directed by Andy Serkis, recognizes that. Like, it knows what the fans want from this franchise, and it gives us more crazy Venom, Eddie Brock madness, and also exploring these characters individually as well, because we actually see them separate from each other, with Venom trying to find someone else that it can inhabit because it's mad at Eddie. And he ends up going to this club, and like there's this euphemism for coming out of the closet, but like he's actually come out of Eddie. It's a whole situation, but it's kind of crazy and mad and silly but wonderful, and I really do think that these two are great comic book movie characters to explore in this franchise, and they really are holding they're really carrying the whole franchise on their shoulders. Now, in terms of the rest of the storyline with Carnage and with that whole situation, like I said, like I could take it or leave it. Like Like it was fine. Do I even remember what Carnage wanted? No. Why does Carnage even like Eddie in the first place? Like, why did he relate to Eddie in the first place? I thought that Carnage would know that Eddie had Venom inside of him, and that's why he would want to like touch Eddie and like get some of that Venom action and become Carnage so he could break out of prison. But he didn't know. So like, why? There's so many questions, but either way, I don't care to answer them because that's not why I'm here. And also, side note, I find it hilarious that this man called Cletus, I think Screen Junkies made a joke about this actually in their honest trailers, but I was thinking it whilst I was watching the film. This whole man called Cletus wants to marry a black woman and like no one's raising eyebrows. No one's asking questions, and honestly that's the most frightening thing about this film. So next up on the docket we have The Last Duel. Now this is a pretty famous film, not really because of the film itself and its contents, but rather because one, it flopped, it bombed, it did very, very poorly at the box office, famously or infamously, and two, because of Ridley Scott's comments surrounding how poorly it did at the box office. So first of all, we have the whole box office situation. I'm actually thinking of doing a bit of a video exploring that and exploring, you know, Ridley Scott's comments surrounding that as well as some trends that we have seen in cinema and in the film industry in the last, I'd say, decade, in this like age of streaming. I am thinking of doing more of these explorative videos for next year. Let's hope that I can actually carry that out, but I do have a bunch of ideas that I want to do for this channel, and that is one of them. So I'm not going to get in deep in terms of my thoughts on that whole situation, but I will say that I think some people are acting a little bit more surprised that it bombed than they should. Like, I think some people may not have been paying attention to what's going on, and they're acting shocked and surprised that The Last Duel bombed, when in reality, if they had been paying attention, they wouldn't be that surprised. And also, I don't think it's the insult that some people think it is to say that this film should have been available on streaming. I think it would have been right at home in Netflix or on Disney Plus. Actually, less on Disney Plus really. On Netflix, I think it would have been great. And some of you may even know that, you know, one of my favorite films of, I think it was like 2019 or something, was The King, which starred Timothée Chalamet. And that was a Netflix movie that was set in the medieval period that I absolutely loved, and still to this day I absolutely love. So I think it would have fit in quite well there, and there have been, you know, more established and more high profile directors working with Netflix in the last few years anyway, so it wouldn't be completely out of place for Ridley Scott to do so as well. So that whole situation is interesting. Let's get to the film itself. I thought it was good. I thought the film was good. I thought the film was really, really great. I think Jodie Comer gave a great performance. Adam Driver was unexpectedly, horrifically, just despicable in this role, and it was really challenging to watch, but I feel like it was structured in such a way that was so interesting. And some of his scenes were really, really difficult to watch, especially as, you know, for those of you who don't know, this film centers on the rape of Jodie Comer's character, and it's told through these three different perspectives. You have, you know, two lies and a truth, basically. I think that's a really interesting structure for that story, but it does mean that we do experience those scenes several times throughout the film from these different angles and different perspectives, but at the same time we get to explore the implications and the consequences of, you know, Jodie Comer's character actually trying to speak up for herself and actually trying to get justice for what was done to her, and we see just how difficult and how much of an uphill battle that is, especially in this medieval setting. It's a really interesting story, and I feel like it was carried out really well. And yes, I do think that it should have made a lot more money than it did, but I'm not surprised that it didn't. Okay, so next one up we have is The French Dispatch. This is yet another movie that is directed by a very highly esteemed director, this time around Wes Anderson. And I personally have a rocky background when it comes to Wes Anderson. I don't adore his films, honestly. Like, sometimes I feel like I just don't get them, and you know, that's just me being honest. I feel like sometimes they're difficult to follow in terms of the story and the different characters and everything. Even though I love the aesthetic, of course, I mean, the Wes Anderson look is just like so unique, although some have tried to copy, aka the director of the Paddington films, but I do feel like they're so unique, they're so distinctly, you know, his visual style, and it's really, really aesthetically pleasing. So I do appreciate that about the films. It's just that sometimes the plot is a little confusing for me to wrap my head around, especially when you have lots of moving parts, like for example the Grand Budapest Hotel, although I feel like in that instance I wasn't paying attention. But it should have gripped me, like it should have made me pay attention, is my point. Anyways, in the case of The French Dispatch, I saw this in the cinema, so I had to pay attention, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. I will say there were some stories that are stronger than others, because the whole premise of this film is that you have this newspaper and this editor has died, and so all of the writers of the newspaper or magazine or something decide to write articles to kind of commemorate him, and because it's written in his will that once he dies, that will be it, like the newspaper will cease to exist, or rather the kind of magazine will cease to exist. And so they write all of these individual stories, and that's kind of how this film is structured, very similarly to The Last Duel, interestingly enough. Although we're not exploring the same events from different perspectives, we're exploring 3 different stories. So in the case of the different stories that are explored, which one was my favorite? Maybe half of the prison one. Half of the Benicio del Toro prison one was really, really good. It felt a little bit long though. I feel like in the second half of that story, I was like, okay, I get the point. We need to move on now. I also really enjoyed the kind of chef story, the police chef story where the kid is kidnapped. And that's the 3rd one, I believe. That was a fun one. But I would say that my least favorite would be the Timothée Chalamet one, where he falls in love with Frances McDormand's character, and then he falls in love with some other girl. Timothée Chalamet's character is very similar to another character that he portrayed in a film in 2021, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But yeah, he's starting to portray these very similar characters, interestingly enough. But I would say that, you know, it's a fun, quirky film. It's inoffensive. It has that Wes Anderson style, and I like the kind of structure of, you know, exploring these 3 different stories. It kind of feels like something that I would do because I'm very indecisive. So it feels like something that I would do to avoid choosing one particular story. I'm like, why not just make all 3? Just make them into little segments. And I think it works because each of the stories don't really warrant a film in their own right. So I think it works as these kind of ficklets that we get within the overall narrative. But like I said, there are some stronger ones and there are some weaker ones. And overall, I wouldn't say that this is the most memorable entry into Wes Anderson's repertoire. Okay, so the next movie up we have is Matrix Resurrections. Yes, I did watch Matrix Resurrections. You know, funny story, when it comes to the Matrix, I fully intended on ranking the Matrix films once this film came out, and I watched all of the Matrix films for the first time this year in preparation for that video. But as you can see from my channel, that video doesn't exist. And neither does the review for this film. Because honestly, like, what do I even say about The Matrix that hasn't already been said? I don't adore this franchise as much as some people do. I appreciate it for how innovative it was, especially for the time and the themes that were explored in the first film. Themes of, you know, AI and being sucked into an artificial world and not knowing, you know, what's real and what isn't, the dangers of technology, I guess, but also from this like very 90s perspective where the internet seems like this just this landscape that was capable of anything and everything. You know, there was this kind of childlike wonder when it came to exploring the internet in the 90s that I think is very much lacking nowadays and is filled with cynicism because we know now what the internet has become. I really do admire what The Matrix did, and I really had a fun time with it when watching it for the first time this year. But I wasn't like chomping at the bit to see the follow-ups, especially knowing that people weren't as much of a fan of the sequels. So I did enjoy parts of the sequels though, I have to say. Like, it wasn't like when I watched the Star Wars sequels where I was like, or I was like, these are awful. Like, it wasn't the case at all when it came to The Matrix. There were times when I was like, hang on, this is actually quite decent. I'm having a fun time. But in the case of this newest one, Matrix Resurrections, oh, I don't know, guys. This film just feels so unnecessary. Why? There are some good ideas here, okay? There are some good ideas. First of all, the idea that Neo would be pulled into this, the Matrix, and he would be fooled into thinking that all of the events of the first film and the subsequent films as well, I believe, were just part of this video game that he programmed. And, whenever he feels like he remembers something, it's because it was programmed in the video game. I think that's clever. I think that's a good idea. Because instead of having to constantly fight against the One, this unstoppable force, they have decided instead to submit him to brainwashing, and that is fortified by Neil Patrick Harris's therapist character. And I think that's really clever. I really enjoyed that aspect of the story, and I couldn't wait to see what they did with that. And also I enjoyed seeing what became of Zion and the fact that it actually kind of developed, and we see this relationship between humans and robots and AI systems kind of change and evolve, which I think makes sense. I mean, this story takes place 60 years after the previous Matrix films, so it makes sense to see that kind of evolution take place on both sides of things when it came to the Matrix and it came to Zion and everything. So yeah, I enjoyed that aspect as well. And then of course, going back to the Matrix itself, we see the implementation of these AI bots that are just kind of hanging around living in society and amongst regular people, and they could be activated at any time to kind of throw as bombs. I guess that was a really interesting idea, the fact that they have these kind of plants throughout this society. So there are interesting ideas here. There are interesting ideas, and we have the return of Keanu Reeves. People love him again. He's at a career high at the moment, especially because of the John Wick films. And yeah, it is interesting to see that he has his John Wick hair at the beginning of this film. I think he should have done something different with it because it was quite distracting. And it was great to also have Carrie-Anne Moss back, even though the explanation for why Trinity would be alive was kind of all over the place. But yeah, she was also forced to submit and forced to just comply with the system, and she was programmed with these this family that she never really wanted, but they kind of manipulated her with these children, and she kind of punches Neil Patrick Harris at the end for that, which I think is fitting for the character. But it was great to have those old characters from the franchise back, as well as introducing some of these new characters. I was a little bit confused about their roles, if I'm being honest. Like I said, I'm not a Matrix head, so I don't remember all of the mythos surrounding the Matrix and everything, even though I watched it literally a couple of months back for the first time. It should be fresh in my mind, but it is quite convoluted sometimes, especially with the sequels, so not everything's stuck, okay? But overall, the biggest sin that this film commits, well actually there are two major sins that it commits. First of all, it's over-reliance on footage from the previous Matrix films. Who are you kidding? Who are you kidding? There's supposed to be footage from the games that Neo created, and okay, but we know that it's just them trying to generate that nostalgia, trying to give us those nostalgic feels for the original Matrix trilogy, and that's why that literally half of this film is just old footage. It's crazy, especially at the beginning. But some of this footage is altered, so it's not the original characters. For instance, Trinity is recast in the games for some reason that's not really explained. But yes, there's such an over-reliance on what came before. It's so obvious. It's so obvious and so jarring. And that issue is compounded by the fact that this film doesn't offer anything new. It doesn't offer anything that's exceptionally exciting and innovative and different in the way that the original Matrix films did. This film film is just a run-of-the-mill action movie with subpar action, might I say, that basically is extremely lucky, extremely fortunate to be attached to the Matrix franchise that has this legendary status, especially with the first Matrix. Like, honestly, if it wasn't for the Matrix tie-in, if this was just the Matrix wannabe that wasn't actually a part of the franchise, it would be looked down upon even more. I feel like it was just so run-of-the-mill, and I had an instinct that it would be, because even looking at the trailers, I was like, well, hang on, where's the green? Doesn't feel like a Matrix film. Where's the green? Like, because the Matrix cinematography was just so distinct for its time, and they got rid of all of that. They got rid of a lot of what made the Matrix so unique and so interesting and innovative, and instead decided to just like rehash some of the iconic scenes that fans love and have watched many times over on their VHSs, as well as diving into some interesting story beats that aren't really fulfilled in an interesting way. And then of course you have the action sequences that are just so subpar. I mean, speaking of John Wick, we know that this is not Keanu Reeves' fault. We know that this is not Keanu. Please, the guy does his own stunts. The guy knows how to sell action, okay? Even though he doesn't know how to sell drama quite as well, or emotion, he knows how to sell action. So you give him good quality material and he will make it work. But there was nothing here that screamed, oh, this is Matrix Resurrections. Like, there was nothing here that would be, you know, taken as a clip on YouTube and people would just watch on repeat in the way that people watch the original bullet time sequences. There's nothing like that in here. There is this scene with like Neil Patrick Harris where he's like moving really quickly, whereas Neo is like slowed down, but that's not interesting. That looks dead. Like, what was that? I was like, hang on, is this supposed to be impressive? Is this supposed to be as impressive as bullet time? Oh, oh baby. Oh no. So yeah, Matrix Resurrections was just like a big pile of meh to me, in my opinion. It had a great cast and it did have great potential. They could have done so much with the idea of returning to the Matrix, especially like I said, because the original Matrix films were made in the 90s and the early 2000s, where we didn't know much about the internet. But now that we have a lot more information about what the internet actually became, there could have been so much more interesting commentary on social media, on, you know, the capitalization on human emotions and how overwhelming social media has become. The idea that these companies like Facebook and other social media sites are capitalizing on people's anger and outrage, you know, outrage economy. All of that stuff could have been explored. Ads as well. The Matrix doesn't have any ads. Should have been ads everywhere. Like, that would have been another evolution for this world, but none of that was really explored. Instead, we got this half-assed storyline about, you know, video games and rehashing sequels and stuff like that, which is ironic because obviously this is a sequel to a very popular franchise to begin with. So like, the lamp shading is there. Like, the lamp shading is present. They're trying to get away with it by shedding light on an issue that they're already partaking in, but it's not working because the commentary isn't clever or interesting. Okay, so next movie up we have Don't Look Up, that is directed by Adam McKay. And I have to say, a lot of these films as well, like, are directed or written by some really, you know, highly regarded directors. I mean, I know that the Wachowskis have had a wobbly path in Hollywood, especially after the first Matrix film, and Lana Wachowski did return to Matrix Resurrections on her own this time around, and not with great success in my opinion. But in the case of Adam McKay, I would say that he is pretty consistently well regarded, and his films and the TV shows that he's associated with, like Succession, are well regarded as well. Which is why I was a little bit disappointed with Don't Look Up. Now, Don't Look Up was a really interesting project, largely because, you know, yes, it's Adam McKay, but also it's Leonardo DiCaprio in a Netflix movie. Like, the world is upside down. The world is upside down, okay? And Leonardo DiCaprio is now on Netflix. It's crazy, it's bonkers, it's wild. I do think it's largely because Adam McKay was attached to the project, like, obviously. He's not doing it for any old Netflix director. But it is still a huge deal. So of course I checked it out on Christmas Eve. Like, of course, of course I checked out the movie. And whilst I think it started off really, really strong, I started to realize that the commentary wasn't going to be as clever, as hard-hitting, as complex or nuanced as I thought it would be, as I thought Adam McKay would be capable of delivering, quite frankly, because even though I knew it was going to have an agenda 100%, and like my personal thinking is in line with that agenda, so I wasn't like against that, but I still wanted it to be clever. I still wanted that commentary to be clever and just to be a little bit more, you know, innovative than what we ended up getting, because what we ended up getting largely felt like any old Reddit thread or Twitter thread that I've seen time and time again, that's not even going viral but it's just kind of there, of people just arguing about these issues, and you know, even though some people have some, you know, fun little jabs in there and there's some funny jokes in there, it doesn't feel like anything really different to what we've seen again on social media in particular, but also in film and television in light of the pandemic and attitudes towards the pandemic, as well as of course attitudes towards science as a whole, this attack on intellect that we've experienced in the last 5 years or so, from all different sides of the world. But yeah, I expected this film to give us a new perspective or a really interesting kind of angle to dive into when it came to commentary on all of the socio-political discourse that we've been getting in the past 5 years in particular. But instead I just got, you know, more of the same. It didn't feel fresh, it didn't feel interesting like, for example, Vice, or certainly not The Big Short. It really didn't feel like the writing was on that level, and I think that was a little bit disappointing. And also, you know, the premise of this film is that there is an asteroid, or a comet actually, a comet that is headed straight towards Earth, and Jennifer Lawrence's character spots this 6 months in advance, and she warns all of the relevant people. She even goes right to the top, you know, the US president herself, who's portrayed excellently, superbly by, of course, Meryl Streep. But of course, no one takes it seriously. You know, everyone's kind of laughing her off. They're worried about, you know, the primaries or whatever. All of this petty stuff that's just so small in the grand scheme of things, especially considering that there is a whole comet headed towards Earth that could eviscerate the planet and life on it. So there's this kind of juxtaposition between the seriousness and the weight of what is actually happening up in the skies versus how people are treating it as, you know, something that's just a funny little segment on a TV show, or, you know, something that's an inconvenience to the president's upcoming campaign. You know, that kind of juxtaposition I think works really well. But I wish that we had seen more of a global response to this issue, considering it is something that will affect the entire planet. It was a little bit weird to me that the rest of the world was such an afterthought in this whole film, and it's kind of brushed off as like, oh, you know, the president did away with everyone else's attempts to blow up the comet. But I feel like that was a very yeah kind of way to dismiss the rest of the world, like the rest of the other like 200 countries on this planet. It was very US focused, which would have been fine if it was a US problem, but it was presented as a global problem. So it's interesting to see how that American bias still exists. The American exceptionalism is still at the basis of this story, which I think kind of contradicts with the messaging of the story overall. And also, even though Americans are at the center of this story, not all Americans are. It's a very particular kind of American, okay? This is yet another classic case of a mostly white cast of people from a certain, you know, demographic, a certain social class even, that are represented in this story, and the rest of us are just kind of chilling, I guess. We get some cameos, we get a couple of significant characters, you know, like we have Tyler Perry, we have the guy who portrays the scientist. You know, to be fair, he is a main character in the film. I can't remember his name at the moment, but he's Turk in the Marvel Netflix shows. Love him. So we do get some representation of, you know, black or POC colors, but it feels largely like a white story, if you know what I mean. It feels like they're there. but they're incidental. Like, they're not really a part of this world in the same way that the white characters are. I do feel like a story like this would have benefited from a more global or diverse perspective, because like I said, you know, social media is out there, and I feel like just a day on Black Twitter could have given this film a lot more interesting kind of commentary, hard-hitting commentary to work with, and also better jokes to work with, because this is supposed to be a comedy, but instead we got something that felt quite plain, a little bit dated, a little bit run-of-the-mill, considering how great this premise actually is. So finally, the last film that we're going to be diving into in this video is unfortunately the one that I'm most disappointed by, and that is The King's Man. Now, where do I even begin with this film? First of all, I should mention, I'm a huge fan of Kingsman: The Secret Service. I think it is one of the very best comic book movies that we have gotten in this, you know, golden age of comic book content so far. I feel like the first Kingsman was just such a refreshing take on the spy action genre. It gave us a flavor that we've never really had in this genre because of the Bond films, you know, feeling so stale and just done at this point. It just gave us this great, fresh, new, modern alternative that I loved. Like, I was putting that in my veins. I watched that film so many times. I'm just a huge fan of that film, and you know, when the sequel came out, I was so excited. And I'm actually a Kingsman 2 apologist. Like, I don't even care. I don't think it's as good as the first one by any stretch of the imagination, but I don't hate it. I just hate some of the decisions that were made in that film. But my discontent with Kingsman 2 doesn't compare to my anger for The King's Man. Okay, I had no interest in this film because it is a prequel, and like, one of the main reasons why I love the Kingsman franchise is because of Eggsy. Are you kidding? Taron Egerton as Eggsy is like iconic. The fact that Eggsy wasn't gonna be in this one, I was like, oh, checked out. But I did end up watching it anyways, and I just wish I honestly hadn't. Like, what is this? What is this? First of all, this is not a Kingsman movie. I don't know who Matthew Vaughn is trying to fool. This is not a Kingsman movie. This is literally just a World War I movie. This was a World War I movie trying to disguise itself as a Kingsman movie. And I noticed. I saw that. Like, I could see what it was trying to do. How annoying. If they wanted to make a World War I movie, just make one. But I guess they can't, because unfortunately, films are having an issue these days where if they're not attached to an IP, then no one's gonna go see it. Okay, fine, I'll give them that concession, whatever. But the fact that the Kingsman elements, you know, the things that were supposed to kind of ground this in the Kingsman universe were just so sporadic. They were just such an obvious afterthought. They were thrown in there for like a you remember that from the first Kingsman movie, but they had no real meaning in this world. It just angered me to no end. It angered me. It felt like a bastardization of a Kingsman movie. So that's just one. And secondly, the story itself just felt so disjointed. Like, it felt like two different films in one. One film is following the story of Ralph Fiennes' character, who, you know, is supposed to be the original Kingsman. He established this establishment, and he had his own story where he used to fight in the wars, like some kind of colonial wars for the British Army, but he turned away from that violence and he pursued a life of pacifism until, of course, he's brought right back into that violence again. That was such a confusing message, because, you know, at first I was fuming by the fact that this story focused on these aristocratic people, when in reality the first Kingsman film is literally about Eggsy, who's from this like lower class background. He's literally living in this like council estate in Camden, and it's specifically Camden because I recognize that architecture, and he was doing parkour on it. It was great. But it's literally about him, you know, from this lower social class being completely overlooked by these, you know, wealthy, well-to-do upper class aristocratic kids who are from Oxbridge, and they look down on him, but he manages to actually get into the Kingsman Secret Service. Like, he is the one that progresses and everyone else fails. But in this film, we're asked to focus on the story of the Duke of Oxford, a character who embodies everything that was entirely opposite to the character of Eggsy and what made him so endearing in the first Kingsman movie. Like, here we're literally following this aristocratic person who, yeah, is like a benevolent aristocrat, but is still part of that same class that looked down on Eggsy and that we were against in the first Kingsman movie. That was so weird. Like, why? Why? And also, this guy is a self-proclaimed war criminal. Listen, okay, he used to fight for the British Army, okay, upholding the British Empire, and we're supposed to root for him. Why? I'm supposed to root for him. Why? And there are actual scenes where we see him fighting against these people of colour, these natives of lands that the British stole, okay, robbed from them. And, you know, he questioned himself. He had a crisis of conscience, and that's all well and good. But then why make the story about him at all? Like, that's my question. Why? Again, I must reiterate that this franchise used to be about the character of Eggsy, who was from a lower class background, kind of elevating into the status of the Kingsman, like that kind of come up story that he had. Whereas now we've reverted back to the James Bond isms, okay, that I despise, and I extensively spoke about this in my James Bond video and everything wrong with the character. So it was so disappointing to see the story focus on this character with this background. And there were so many problematic elements as well. Like, even though he is this benevolent character, he's still part of that class, so he had a ton of privilege, he had a ton of sway, like he was having convos with King George himself, like what? And also the fact that his, you know, black best friend, the compulsory black best friend in these franchises, Digimon Honsu, was actually his servant, like his manservant, and that's never really explained either. It's just kind of taken as like a, yeah, like he happened to really like the Duke of Oxford, even though he was a colonizer, and so he followed him to the ends of the earth and was even willing to take a bullet for him. Like, I just, oh, I hated this. I hated this so much. And then we have Gemma Arterson's character, who's like the stereotypical, you know, girls get it done kind of character, where she's better than all the boys in the room. She can just shoot people, and she never misses her mark and all of that. Yeah, you know, that's fine. I thought we were past this. I thought we were actually trying to develop female characters and make them complex and even fallible to make them more relatable. But no, I guess that's not what this franchise wants to do anymore. Whatever, it's okay. Although, to be fair, it's never really done that, so I guess I shouldn't be surprised. But then the second part of this story focuses on Conrad and this kind of weird attempt at recreating one of the best films in the last few years, 1917. They thought I wouldn't notice that this film was trying so hard to be 1917. Guess what I did notice? I noticed almost immediately. Conrad is so annoying, okay? And he shouldn't be annoying, but he really is, because one, he's constantly going on about how he wants to join the war and, you know, how sweet it is to, you know, fight for your country, as the Latin saying goes. And his father's constantly telling him, you don't want to do that. I have experience being in war. Like, you don't want to do that. You don't know what you're talking about. And he's like, but I'm an adult now and I want to join the war. But in the end, when he does see them through, it ends in tragedy with him losing his life. But he manages to get this note, this message that ends up getting the Americans involved in the war, which is interesting because the win here, the big win isn't that the war is over. The big win is that the UK now has support from America to join the war, so that they're more likely to, you know, win or not end up with a German invasion. Like, that's what they're gunning for the whole time, which is odd because the film establishes that war is bad, so many people die, and yet the win, the goal, is to get the Americans to join the war, get their young lads, like their boys, to join the war and fight in this pointless war to add to the kill count. What? Like, how is this a win? I don't understand what's going on. Sure, the UK is not going to be invaded now, but more people are going to die. Like, why are we celebrating this? And also, I just think when it comes to Conrad's storyline, Harris Dickinson wasn't giving Taron Egerton. Like he really wasn't. Like, not all of the white boys can do it, okay? And not only this, but this film surprisingly has Aaron Taylor Johnson in it. I didn't see that coming, okay? But Aaron Taylor Johnson is not only in this film, but he is portraying this kind of commander who's part of this like Scottish regiment. Is it a regiment? I don't know anything about the army. I'm so sorry. The Scottish regiment. And, you know, Conrad swaps places with him so that he can join the war because his dad arranged for him to basically do nothing in his current regiment. And then Aaron Taylor Johnson's character goes to Conrad's father and he explains the whole situation. And Conrad's father doesn't like slap him, which is what I would do if I found out that this man standing in front of me had swapped places with my child, so that he was in the front, like he was in the battlefield, and meanwhile this man is like standing here safe and secure and in the warmth of my house. How is Ralph Fiennes not slapping this guy? That doesn't make sense. Not only did he not slap him, but in the end he becomes a part of the original Kingsman, which makes no sense. Like, what? The guy literally facilitated the death of your son. It makes no sense. But I do think the best part of this film by far was Rasputin. Rasputin was an icon, a legend, a VIP in this film. Everything else though, boring, disappointing, very confusing and conflicting with its messaging, and just not fundamentally a Kingsman movie. But that's it from me. Now that I told you guys what I've been watching, the movies that I checked out later on in the year, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of these movies and what you guys have been watching down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.